Hello again, everyone, and welcome. I am Ron Hood. I'm a co-chair of the Constance Baker Motley series on racial inequality, as well as a co-chair of the Connecticut Bar Association's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. I am also a civil litigator at Bartlett and Grippy. It is my pleasure tonight to welcome you all to this session and this bar year summative session of the Constance Baker Motley series on racial inequality. This series was established in 2020 by and continues to be a cooperative effort between the Connecticut Bar Association and the Connecticut Bar Foundation. This series is an ongoing forum for the Connecticut legal community to explore issues of racial inequality and systemic racism. The series goal is to support and foster commitment to advancing civil rights and social justice in Connecticut. Constance Baker Motley was a trailblazing civil rights attorney who became the nation's first Black female to serve as federal judge and later chief judge. Judge Motley was born in New Haven, Connecticut, and maintained strong connections to Connecticut throughout her life. As this is the summative event for this bar year, the series co-chairs and I would like to thank everyone for another successful year in this series. Also like to thank the steering committee for this series, as well as Joel Motley and Connie Royster for their ongoing support and feedback on this series. Tonight's session is titled The Legacy of Judge Constance Baker Motley. During this summative event, speakers will explore the legacy of Judge Motley through narratives of some of Connecticut's Black trailblazers. Through their personal and professional narratives, our speakers will discuss the impact Judge Motley had on their personal and professional lives. Through this lens, we will explore Judge Motley's impact on community, education, criminal justice, and the legal profession broadly. So without further ado, we'll begin our discussion tonight with Attorney Vanessa Avery.
Good evening. I am Vanessa Roberts Avery, United States Attorney for the District of Connecticut, and I am thrilled and honored to be here tonight with such an amazing panel to honor the extraordinary life of its namesake for the series, the Honorable Constance Baker Motley. There are people in our lives who inspire us, even though we've never met them. And Judge Motley was one of those people for me. I am grateful for this opportunity to reflect and share the impact that her life and career have had on mine. Though she was certainly a giant of American history, and I can only aspire to such renown, I am reflecting on her, notice that there are several commonalities between Judge Motley's life and my own. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time on that before passing the baton to my panelists. Both Judge Motley and I grew up in New Haven. We both attended and graduated from the New Haven Public Schools. And due to the financial generosity of others who recognized the promise in each of us, in her case, a single wealthy philanthropist, and in mine, through well-established financial aid programs, we both went on to graduate college and law school, and then began active careers as practicing attorneys in our respective jurisdictions. There are also some similarities in our personal lives. Like Judge Motley, I'm a wife and mother who is committed to my family, immediate and extended. and to the broader community, including safeguarding the civil rights guaranteed under the United States Constitution, federal statute, and other laws. And though we both have the great distinction of being designated as historic firsts, Judge Motley's list is certainly far more lengthier than mine. For starters, she was the first Black woman to attend and graduate Columbia School of Law, Columbia Law School. She was also the first woman of any race elected as Manhattan Borough President, and the first Black woman ever elected to the New York State Senate. As an attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Judge Motley, before she became a judge, litigated hundreds of desegregation cases, appearing in many courtrooms around the country, including the southern states, where she was the only woman or the only person of color or both to argue there, and likely on many occasions, the first. And while most attorneys only dream of arguing a case before the United States Supreme Court, before she became a judge, Constance Baker Motley argued 10 cases there, winning all but one, and that one was later overturned in her favor. As I said, a giant of the civil rights movement and of American history. Ultimately, Judge Motley went on to be appointed as the United States District Judge, the first Black woman to become a federal judge in the United States, and she ultimately served as Chief Judge of the district. What her list of accomplishments and firsts has taught me is that Constance Baker Motley understood her purpose in life, and she pursued it with great resolve. One of my favorite inspirational quotes of hers is, she's credited with saying, "Something which we think is impossible now is not impossible in another decade." And I remember the first time I read that quote, and reflecting on it, I thought that it was somewhat profound. I still remember reciting it about 15 years ago to the membership assembled at the meeting in Hartford of the George W. Crawford Black Bar Association. And I'll repeat it again. Something which we think is impossible now is not impossible in another decade. She doesn't say another century or another 50 years, but that in just 10 years, that's all you need to accomplish the impossible. And it stuck with me then, and it has stuck with me ever since. Her purpose, as I understood it, was to root out racism and racial discrimination in society. She had no intentions of waiting around for someone to do it in the next generation or even decades from then. She had the courage, confidence, and humility, the resiliency and the perseverance that was required to do the work during her lifetime. And I have found that incredibly inspiring in the work that I do, especially thinking back to the era of American history when she lived and when she worked. I often reflect when I am faced with challenges today on the challenges that she must have faced during her time. And every time that I'm required to step further outside of my comfort zone in my current role and in past roles and walk into a room where I have as much to learn as I have to offer, I think of her example and her sacrifice. Judge Motley's example has led me to conclude that one person's impact can be profound. One woman's impact, even a Black woman from very humble beginnings, can impact people, men and women of every background in beneficial ways, and move the world in positive directions that we may have thought were impossible just 10 years ago. I'll stop there for now and pass the baton to my fellow panelists, to Sean Bowden Lewis.
Thank you, Vanessa. Good evening, everyone. I do want to say thank you to the Connecticut Bar Foundation and CBA. And also, I am just so thrilled to be in this panel with you powerhouses. You women have done some wonderful things, and it's an honor for me to be here with you all tonight. So with that being said, when I think about Judge Motley, I think about that she was a Renaissance woman, right? And that is something to me that is very, very touching. You know, she was not only a wife, not only a mother, not only a litigator, but she was a true a mover and shaker and a change agent. And there's a quote that she has from her autobiography, Equal Justice Under Law, that says, I was the kind of person who would not be put down. I rejected any notion that my race or sex would bar my success in life. And that resonates with me deeply. That kind of tenacity, that kind of determination and grit is what I aspire to continue to do and to continue to be like, because there are obstacles and challenges every single day. As the Chief Public Defender for the state of Connecticut, it is my privilege to serve in that position. And it is, yes, it's challenging, but it's a joy and it's my passion, as I've been a public defender for my entire legal career, which is 26 years. So when I think about and read about what Judge Motley has done in her life, she was a Black woman. I'm proud of that, as I'm very proud of that. And she was a woman of many firsts. And for me, to be the first Black chief in the state is huge. And so I look to people who have gone before me, and that includes Judge Motley. And so there is she battled racism and sexism, that dual-edged sword of being a Black person and being a woman. It's empowering, it is awesome, it is inspiring, and also very difficult too. When we look at leaders, we often look at the males, we often look at those who are non-white. But Judge Motley carved out a niche for herself and for the rest of us that leaves a legacy that is astounding. And when you think about the fact that she was the change agent for so many cases, especially in the South, for so many different situations, but yet as the writer, I believe Gary Ford Jr. wrote in one of his essays, the fact that she was not recognized. In fact, he wrote, she was a change agent who was marginalized in traditional historical narratives. And it's true. We think about James Meredith, yes, he broke the barrier, but who did the work to get him there? It was Judge Motley. She was behind the Legal Defense Fund for NAACP, many of their victories, many of the briefs that they wrote. But we think about Thurgood Marshall, we think about other people, and we rarely think about Judge Motley. But yes, she did the work. And she continued to do the work, even though she was not promoted to be the director counsel of the Legal Defense Fund, though she should have, because her work, actually was beyond amazing and groundbreaking and trailblazing. But she still stayed for years before she moved on to the political arena and did the work. She put in the time and effort. And that's what it's all about. The women on this panel with me today have put in the work, and the fruits of their labor are evident every single day. And so all of us have this baton, as Vanessa said, that we have received from our ancestors, from those who went before us. And Judge Motley is one of those. She is a defining figure in history. Not many people know about her. Not many people even understand the things that she has done. But for those who do, oh, what a time, right? Oh, what a time. Because she has made it possible for us to be able to have this whole situation of desegregation. Desegregation, her work made that possible. That we can all be sitting at the same lunch counter. We can all drink the same water fountain. Those were the blood and sweat and tears of Judge Motley, her work. And that's a phenomenal legacy to be able to embrace and to expound upon. And I, like everyone else on this panel, we're just so honored to be here and to glow and bask in the fact that we have predecessors who have paved the way. And as we make our own marks, doing that for somebody else, paying it back, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And so, yes, Judge Motley has touched me in many, many ways. And I hope that I can touch someone else in the same way too. So thank you.
I think I might be next alphabetically. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Natalie Braswell. I currently serve as the General Counsel for Governor Ned Lamont. It's been quite a 6-month period in this position. Lots of ups, lots of downs, and I've just finished my first legislative session, as we've been talking about first. I've just nominated my first class of judges to the Superior Court, about 20 of them, so excited about that. I wanted to touch on a topic that Vanessa and Tashawn both talked about, and it is this issue of being the first. As I sit on this panel with individuals, Tashawn, the first Black female public defender, in the chief public defender in the state of Connecticut, and Miss Avery representing the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Connecticut, which is just wow. And Miss Nelson, who is the first Black female dean of the University of Connecticut School of Law. So I think, you know, and Professor Falami, I can't even imagine the first that you have accomplished in your storied career as well. And I just think that, you know, we talk a lot about sort of this concept of the first and how it's so great to, you know, have risen to these positions. But I think sometimes we forget about how hard it was to get to the position, number one, but number two, how hard it is to be in that position as the first. You know, there's a lot of obstacles that, you know, pave the way to get there, but we don't necessarily always talk about the obstacles that stand in our way while we're in that position and how you navigate that. And, you know, I looked back as I was preparing to talk about the legacy of Judge Motley, and, you know, hers is a legacy of public service. And while she'd made so many accomplishments, we can't forget that she was the first Black woman to be appointed to the federal bench in 1966. Like, that's not a long time ago when you talk about first. And we look at all of the firsts for all of the women that are on this panel right now that recently occurred, just in the last couple of years. And, you know, they're still first to accomplish. There still hasn't been a Black female appointed to the Supreme Court in the state of Connecticut. So there's still a lot more firsts to occur. And there's always, you know, someone that's there or something that's there that tries to sort of diminish sort of the achievement of being in that position of the first. One of the things that I hadn't realized as I was doing this is, you know, when Thurgood Marshall was appointed to the Supreme Court, there were many that thought that Judge Motley should have been the individual that was appointed to that position. And it was completely, even with progressive Democrats, unheard of. And just people couldn't even fathom that a Black female would be nominated to sit on the US Supreme Court. And it was just sort of dismissed. And look how long it took us before we got a Black female appointed, again, very recently, to the US Supreme Court. So I think sometimes we forget that the road hard traveled, even once we reach that destination, is still a road hard traveled to achieve the things that we want to achieve. I want to touch back on my unofficial title as the first Black female general counsel for a governor in the state of Connecticut. I say unofficial because I'm not sure there's a record yet, but we'll make one. And, you know, being very intentional about the position that I'm in and the role that I serve in terms of being supportive of my position and being cognizant of my position and what it is that I can do with my position to help support diversity, equity, and inclusion in the legal profession as a whole. And I look at, for example, our last judges classes that I put together and recommended to the governor for individuals to be nominated, and how I was very intentional about the individuals that were nominated on that list in terms of diversity, because I do believe, as Judge Motley, and I'm sure there are many judges of color that are sitting on this webinar right now, that representation is very, very important. And we see that through the life and legacy of Judge Motley. And representation on the bench in particular is very, very important. And we've seen that over the years as, for some of us, our faith in the rule of law has been shaken with certain decisions that have come down from the federal courts, and knowing that these state courts are like our last line of defense for a lot of things when we think about justice and equality. And just being very intentional in making sure that the face of our judiciary represents the communities that they're in and are reflective of those communities. And so I've tried to be, as I'm sure everyone else on the panel has in their respective positions, be very intentional in the way that I use my position to further advance the ideals that Judge Motley lived her life to push forward. And that's all I've got.
So I just a little bit about myself. I am a professor of law at Hofstra University, Morris A. Dean School of Law at Hofstra University in New York. I came out of practice. I went to Columbia Law School, went straight into a law firm, which was after clerking with Judge Motley. Going to a law firm, without a doubt, was by far the result of the nudging of Judge Motley. You could give me a second, because there was the father's thing from my mind. In fact, I questioned whether certain work, where you could do kind of progressive work at a law firm. And what I've since learned, I was very active in pro bono work, is you can do social justice work wherever you are. And so I just want to say first, I'm so thankful and grateful to be on this panel with so many of you. It's incredibly warming, inspiring, and encouraging as a human being just to be involved in this profession of ours, and to hear you speak of Judge Motley. I am enriched by your comments, and I've been invited to offer additional comments as a former clerk of Judge Motley. I am indeed honored to do so. And as the planners know, I had to squeeze this in, and because I'm in the chair of our Dean Search Committee, so I'm in the middle of, but I knew I had to make this today to speak of Judge Motley. For a full year of my life, I sat at her proverbial feet and soaked in her legal mind, but also so much more than that, like how she moved, particularly as it related to me. I could talk about the many hours we spent drafting very intricate judicial opinions that turned on various areas of law, stemming from employment discrimination to patent infringement. But so many of our other law clerks could likely talk about that as well. Instead, I'd like to share the ways in which this force of a woman left impressions on me that extended far beyond our discussions about the law. Now, I can't talk about my experiences with Judge Motley without revealing a little bit about my 20-something-year-old self. I was the rebel. I was the one who was tired, frustrated, and annoyed by the socioeconomic inequity that I saw in my surrounding community. I would go on to law school after college, still tired, frustrated, and annoyed. Indeed, I graduated law school and was still tired, frustrated, and annoyed. So by the time I arrived to clerk with Judge Motley, she was well into her 70s and still carrying a full docket of cases. Here I was, a new graduate of Columbia Law School, who performed well in school, but was definitely, if you haven't picked up, disenchanted by the law and by the apparent continued gradualistic approach to remedying racial inequality. I was the child of a woman 16 years my junior. I was more familiar with the grittier side of urban America than the walls of Ivy League institutions in America, never mind the majestic inner beauty and workings of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, where Judge Motley served. In our conversations, we disagreed. Perhaps the rebel and her frustration about the law came out on occasion. I was deferential and respectful, but most definitely I shared my voice. She was more than open to hearing it. Sometimes she shrugged me off like the elder that she was. And other times, actually, most times, she engaged me. What I remember clearly was the impression that I was left with, which was that of being heard and seen in a way that was not always the case in law school. While we may have disagreed at times in our conversation, she always came across as patient and always nudging for me to continue in thought, analysis, and movement. She commanded and walked in her authority, which was well-deserved from her experience. I knew it then and still know it now. In her chambers, there was a picture of her impeccably dressed. For those of you who know anything about her, she shopped. Lord & Taylor was without a doubt her store. She was impeccably dressed with what I believe was a National Guardsman holding a rifle pointed upwards towards the sky near her head. If you look at Judge Motley in the picture, she's looking straight ahead, stone-faced, as if there wasn't a rifle pointed straight near her head. None of my book knowledge on revolutions could compare to those images or the many stories that she would share liberally with me and my co-clerk. Her stories were filled with detail, impressively so. Maybe because she was writing her autobiography at the time titled Equal Justice Under the Law. Maybe you know of it. One such story she shared with us was when she argued a case before a panel of judges, appellate court judges in the South, where all of the judges turned their back on her. She continued arguing her case anyhow. Can you imagine? I don't recall now if that story ever made it in her book, but my co-clerk and I soaked it in incredulously. She would also share, as Vanessa did, how she won every case she argued before the Supreme Court, save one that she would point out was reversed a few years later. That did make it in the book, for sure. It seemed like Judge Motley was loading my co-clerk and I with tons of stories as if to fortify us for the long and continued stride towards justice. So not only when we are the first, as Natalie spoke of, but how do you maintain and sustain yourself when you are in those positions? I wasn't quite sure then, but it seemed like she was nudging me to stay the course, without the course itself eating me up alive while I advanced in and through it. I would learn later that her cousin, John Huggins, in her autobiography, she speaks of this, was a Black Panther, 19-year-old Black Panther who was killed in a shootout with the Connecticut police. I don't know, perhaps with me, she saw something and wanted to guide that, not necessarily quell or squash that spirit in me. Even in pondering about Judge Motley's interactions with me years later, I can't help but know that she was trying to teach me something more than a critical eye towards legal analysis, but about how to engage the struggle, how to maintain and survive and then thrive, notwithstanding that engagement with it, which itself was, according to poet Audre Lorde, a revolutionary act in and of itself. A few years back, I attended an event at Quinnipiac Law School honoring Judge Motley with Charlene Hunter Galt, who was instrumental in desegregating University of Georgia. Charlene spoke about the moment when she was 16 and unsure that she could go through with all this stuff these lawyers were talking about doing in their desegregation plan. She spoke of how she abruptly left the planning session to go sit in a car while to wait outside. She would share the story of how Judge Motley came out to the car, sat with her, guide, mentor, nudge, through the emotionality that comes along with movements for justice. I know that woman of whom Charlene spoke. She never instructed me directly to do this or that. She nudged. Many of her lessons were informal, not direct, but observational. How she carried herself, walked even in a room, even down to the way she interacted with her husband, Judge Motley. On the bench, as I mentioned, she commanded authority. In fact, the first time she ever made a joke in chambers to me and my co-clerk, we were frozen. We didn't even know whether to laugh or not. She was a totally different personality, by the way, behind chambers. But it was a totally different personality when she engaged with Mr. Motley. Basically, she was in some ways deferential. He would sit there all day while she worked in the court and came and sat. But when Mr. Motley was ready to go, Connie, I'm ready to go, Connie. And what would Connie do? Judge Motley do? Connie would get up and go, right? So author Tamika Nagin, in her book, Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley, The Struggle for Equality, picks up on their unconventional relationship. On the one hand, Mr. Motley is the one who stayed home with their child, their son, their only child, Joel Motley Jr., I think Joel Motley III, actually, and raised him while she traveled the South. What I witnessed among them was gentleness and tenderness, and although they bickered and got into it at times, and Mr. Motley was the one who drove them around. When Mr. Motley was ready to go, well, he was ready to go. And Judge Motley went along. I would gain access to this tenderness between them both, and in particular, Judge Motley, when she invited me and my co-clerk to her summer home in Connecticut. It was a much slower pace, filled with homemade lemonade and breakfast cooked by Judge Motley herself, and evenings spent sitting by the ocean. What we learned from that was, I think, her nudging for us to engage in self-care as well. I'll end my comments with one of the best stories, I think, of all. Judge Motley would invite me over to her apartment in Manhattan a few Saturdays every month. She would pull out all of her memorabilia, all of her pictures and her pictures of the clothing she would wear to a lot of gala and events, including as Manhattan Borough President or the first Black woman judge, receptions, etc. And then out of the blue, she actually started pulling out those clothes and those pictures. And guess what happened next? She then says, try them on. Why don't you see what they feel like on you? So what does Akila Falami do? Try them on. Next sentence, whatever you fit, you can have. Whatever you can fit, you can have. So Akila Falami was pulling and sucking and tucking and trying to inhale and was able and willing and completely walked away with a lot of the outfits that the indomitable Constance Baker Motley wore at these events. The act was an act of investing in me. It said, take care of yourself. That struggle in community building is protracted. It takes strategy and planning and more than just surviving and reacting. That we must find our humanity in it all, and even still retreat and retrench when necessary in order to heal, refocus, learn, re-energize as first, as seconds, as those who sustain, maintain, or what have you. I look back at those days in awe and gratitude. She was a formidable woman. I am honored to have known her. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share those moments that I still continue to hold dear and by which I continue to be shaped. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Ebony Nelson. I have the honor of serving as the Dean of the University of Connecticut School of Law. And I really want to thank the CBA and the CBF for this wonderful opportunity to be with my wonderful sisters-in-law, talking about such a trailblazer, such a heroine, such a change agent that is Judge Constance Baker Motley. I also want to thank the Motley family. I had the honor of having Joel Motley as our commencement speaker last May and had the opportunity to spend some time with him and members of the Motley family. So I want to thank them for supporting this important series. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of my panelists, and I believe it's safe to say that we owe a great deal of gratitude to Judge Motley, because if it were not for her, really, truly, none of us would really be here and be able to have the positions and be able to have the opportunity to serve in the ways that we do. So prior to deaning, when I had more time to be in the classroom, my scholarship and my passion was really in the areas, and continues to be, although I'm not in the classroom as much anymore, continues to be in the area of race, class, and education. And it has always been a passion of mine to do all that I can to ensure that there are equitable educational opportunities for all students, particularly students of color and those from economically disadvantaged and challenged backgrounds. And this is so because I am a firm believer that education is truly the gateway to opportunity. It is incumbent upon us to make sure that we are ensuring that the schoolhouse doors are literally and figuratively open to everyone, and that we are giving everyone the support and the tools that they need to be successful once they walk through those doors. And so when I reflect on Judge Motley's impactful legacy, her dedication to educational equity and access strongly resonates with me both professionally and personally. Perhaps like many of us on the panel or in attendance, I'm a direct beneficiary of Judge Motley's and others' efforts to end racial segregation in both K through 12 and in higher education. I'm a proud product of South Carolina public elementary, middle, and high schools, which I would not have been able to attend had it not been for Judge Motley and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund's successful efforts in a case called Briggs versus Elliott, which challenged segregation in the K through 12 context in public South Carolina schools. Briggs is one of those cases of 5 that were joined with Brown versus Board of Education, which we all know, thankfully, held that separate is inherently unequal when it comes to race and K through 12 education. But as alluded to by Tashawn, when we discuss seminal cases like Brown versus Board of Education, we often leave out the litigation strategy that led to Brown, as well as the unsung heroine that is Constance Baker Motley and the incredible role that she played to bring about that case and cases that led to it and cases that came after it. The road to Brown was paved by successful challenges to this so-called notion of separate but equal that was advanced and adopted in Plessy v. Ferguson. Particularly in the higher education context, we see an attacking of that Judge Motley was so instrumental in doing. One of the very first cases that she worked on when she joined the LDF was Sweat versus Painter, which was a 1950 case in which the Supreme Court allowed for an African-American man to be admitted into the University of Texas School of Law. UT Law School had denied his admission because they said they had a separate but equal law school that they had hastily put together in the basement without dedicated faculty, without dedicated library, without dedicated resources. But nonetheless, they were trying to make the argument that that was separate and equal, such that Heman Sweat did not need to attend the University of Texas and instead could attend this new law school for, quote, Negroes, known at the time as the Texas State University for Negroes. Well, I am, again, a proud product in that that school is now the Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern University, which is the institution where I got my start as a professor nearly 20 years ago this fall. And I am forever thankful that the doors of Thurgood Marshall School of Law was open to me so that I could have that opportunity to join the academy as a professor. But it was the hard work of Judge Motley and the NAACP that led to the admission of Heman Sweat to UT Law School. And in so doing, it really started to lay the foundation for the importance of diversity in education, particularly higher education. And when the court talked about the reason why this new law school for, quote, Negroes was inefficient and insufficient, it wasn't just based on the resources or the lack thereof. Instead, the court talked about the fact that the law school, and I'm going to quote here the court from its opinion, the law is a highly learned profession. We are all aware that it is an intensely practical one. The law school, the proving ground for legal learning and practice, cannot be effective in isolation from the individuals and institutions with which the law interact. I think that last part is worth repeating. Cannot be effective in isolation from the individuals and the institutions with which the law interacts. When we think about those words and that reasoning all the way back in 1950, it is just as applicable today. We know we sit here today awaiting the Supreme Court's decision in the context of race-conscious affirmative action. We know that it will come any day now. Unfortunately, I hope I'm wrong, but I think that that may end up being the death knell of race-conscious affirmative action as we know it. And one of the reasons why that is so concerning is several reasons, but one of the reasons is when we think about how we are supposed to educate future lawyers and future advocates for this diverse world in which they're living. If we don't have diverse learning environments in which we can talk together, debate together, engage in critical thinking together, get to know people from different backgrounds and helping that to inform what our own thinking is as we are going out to advocate on behalf of others in this global, diverse, wonderful society in which we live and work, then we're not doing our jobs as educational institutions. And race-conscious affirmative action has been the most effective tool by which to help diversify educational institutions in the higher education context. And the groundwork and the foundation for those cases that came 20, 30 years down the road in which the Supreme Court permitted race-conscious affirmative action was laid by Judge Motley and the NAACP way back in cases like Sweat versus Painter. A similar case that was decided by the Supreme Court on the same day as that Sweat versus Painter case, which Judge Motley played a critical role, was McLaurin versus Oklahoma State Regents for Higher Education. In McLaurin, we had a Black doctoral student challenging the University of Oklahoma's segregated educational practices, again, chipping away at this idea of separate but equal. And so the appalling features of that practice warrant an exact description, and I'm going to read it from the court's opinion. He was required to sit apart at a designated desk in an anteroom adjoining the classroom, to sit at a designated desk on the mezzanine floor of the library, but not to use the desk in the regular reading room, and to sit at a designated table and to eat at a different time from the other students in the school cafeteria. In the interval between the decision of the court below and the hearing of the court, the treatment afforded appellate was altered. For some time, the section of the classroom in which appellate sat was surrounded by a rail on which there was a sign stating reserved for colored, and I quote, but these have been removed. He is now assigned a seat in the classroom in a row specified for colored students. He is assigned to a table in the library on the main floor, and he is permitted to eat. Imagine that. The imagine that is my addition. And he is permitted to eat at the same table, at the same time in the cafeteria as others permitted to eat. Although here again, he is assigned to a special table. It was not that long ago when this was the experiences that a Black doctoral student was having at one of our state institutions in this country. And when we think about the isolation and the feelings of not belonging that a lot of our students of color still feel today, no, they may not be in an anteroom, but the experiences that are having in our educational environments, both at the higher education context, as well as the K through 12 context. And we only need to look at the challenges to the educational topics and discussions that we are seeing across the country. And again, even in our state in Connecticut, the challenges to the full history being taught in our educational institutions, those two are isolating. And so we must be like Judge Motley as we draw upon her legacy to keep the schoolhouse doors open. We should draw upon her legacy of fierce, steadfast, strategic, and creative advocacy to keep the schoolhouse doors open. Discussion of Judge Motley's legacy, as we've heard already this evening, always mentions certain attributes, certain descriptors: a first, African-American, woman, because she was a trailblazer, opening the doors for opportunities for others. Vanessa and others have already listed the various ways in which she was a first, so I won't add to that for the sake of time. But like myself and my co-panelists have had to endure throughout our lives and career, Judge Motley had to navigate spaces in which she encountered both invisibility and hypervisibility, and heightened scrutiny and opposition due to her race and gender. As is unfortunately often the case for women and people of color, she had to overcome unfounded assumptions of, quote, presumed incompetence as she navigated those spaces. In her writings, she recounted being ignored by the white male gatekeeper at the New York City Bar Association when she went to use its library. After displaying disbelief that she was actually a member and that her name, Mrs. Motley, as she had told him, was on the membership list, he proceeded to grant, quote, Constance, as he referred to her, admittance. His refusal to grant her the same respect he surely would have granted a white male attorney was not lost on Judge Motley. She also recounted that before nominating her to the district court, President Johnson had initially submitted her name for a seat on the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. But the opposition to her appointment was so great, apparently because she was a woman, that President Johnson had to withdraw her name. I suspect her race played a role in that as well. Judge Motley stated that one of the most critical lessons she learned from her mentor, advocate, and supporter, Justice Thurgood Marshall, was to laugh off these ludicrous anti-feminist affronts which were regularly hurled her direction. She refused to let them deter her from achieving her goals and dreams. And I greatly admire Judge Motley for her example of fearless fortitude in the face of foolishness. She is an important aspect, and this is an important aspect of her legacy that has inspired others for generations. I imagine that Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson reflected on Judge Motley's inspiring example of courage and resilience several times throughout her confirmation process last spring, during which she too was subjected to heightened scrutiny and opposition that all too often befall women first of color. For me, one of the most poignant moments of Justice Jackson's confirmation was Senator Cory Booker's impassioned speech on the third day, in which he praised Justice Jackson and acknowledged the trials and tribulations she had to endure on her journey to the Supreme Court. Throughout his speech, his constant refrain was, "Nobody's stealing my joy. Nobody's stealing my joy." He was talking about the joy of the historic moment, the joy of Justice Jackson and her remarkable journey, the joy of progress that is attributed directly to the amazing trailblazing legacy of Judge Motley and so many others, courageous, brilliant, committed, and determined Black women who came before and after her, to whom we all owe a debt of gratitude. After his speech, my personal refrain became "Count It All Joy," which is the title of one of my favorite gospel songs by brother-sister duo BB and CC Winans. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to sing. Some of you already know that is not my strong suit. Well, interestingly, evidently, Judge Motley and I had this in common. When Judge Ann Claire Williams reflected on Judge Motley's legacy, she recalled the following: although she loved music, she could not sing. She was such a bad singer that as a little girl growing up in New Haven, she was asked to leave the choir. Judge Constance Baker Motley could not carry a tune, but she spent her life singing songs of equal justice in perfect harmony. I encourage all of us to exemplify Judge Motley and to build upon her impactful legacy by joining the chorus, calling for equal opportunity, equal access, and equal justice. Let's all commit to, quote, making a joyful noise as we honor her and her legacy by continuing the endless yet endlessly rewarding fight for civil rights and justice for all. Thank you.
All right. Wow. Before we get into any of the audience questions, which I would encourage our audience to submit if they have them, I want to give all our panelists and speakers an opportunity to respond to anything that they've heard or that spoke to them that our other panelists have said. I heard a lot of recurring themes, but I know you all have very different professions and careers and paths that you've taken. And so I'd love to hear any responses or reactions that our panelists have. I'll go back to Attorney Avery. Can I start with you?
Sure, thank you for putting me on the spot. Yes, I mean, I will just say it's been incredible to listen to the different perspectives that everybody has brought to the impact she's had. And it makes me reflect even more on what I started with, just thinking about how one person can have such an impact on so many people. And not just people who look like us, not just Black women, but really everyone. She's touched so many lives across this country. And it was just so moving to hear Professor Falami talk about being a clerk and having those personal experiences with her. I think many of us on this panel, and certainly folks in the audience as well, have read some of the autobiographies and books and listened to other panels, but to hear it all in this context by people who are trying to follow in her footsteps, if I can speak for some of us, I think is just really powerful and moving. So that's my initial reaction here. I'm taking notes and jotting down a few things so that I can keep them with me. I think one of the biggest things that I liked as a theme coming from all of us is how you move forward with the challenge of walking into those spaces where there may not be a lot of people who look like us there, but knowing that you need to have the confidence to go forward anyway because of the mission that you are taking with you. And she certainly seemed to be very mission driven. Shall I pass the torch to someone or? Okay, go ahead.
I think for me, the aspect of mentorship, right? I think that Judge Motley truly, and it was demonstrated in what Professor Falami had said, but clearly she mentored many people who were who became judges, other people that she touched, and that is what it's all about, right? Again, the whole concept of giving back and of helping someone else along the path, because none of us will be here forever, but our legacies will be dependent on the fact of how we actually deposit seeds into other people and let them grow on their own. And so the mentorship aspect of what Judge Motley did, how she was, and just the humanity in that, right? I mean, boy, if I could have gotten one of her little outfits or dresses, I'd be like, yes, that would have been beautiful, but that's, so not just, talking about law, it's about being personable and being, human and really nurturing. And so I just think that's beautiful. And in all of what we've all said here, the beauty of it is resounding in everything we've said.
Are we going in order, or can I jump in?
You can jump in.
Oh, so I would offer, well, first I have a question of all the panelists. I'd be curious to know when folks first heard of Judge Motley, if you will. Like, so for me in law school, I went to Columbia Law School where Judge Motley went, and I was in a class with Jack Greenberg, who, as you know, became the director of LDF, and they were still friends. But I offer that to say, in law school, you didn't hear a lot about, and I think you had mentioned that, Tashana, you didn't hear a lot about Constance Baker Motley. So I would be curious to hear, when did you learn of her? A colleague, when I told him about this panel today, who went to Yale, was saying he hadn't heard of her either in all of her years in all of his years in law school, until I think he said there was a movement among the women in the law school to put up a picture of a woman, lawyer or, in the profession, a mover and shaker. And so she was one of the women whose picture was put up in law school. So I'll be curious to hear that. And then what I'll offer my thoughts, which were then and still are now, was at the time with Judge Motley. I mean, there's this tension in our society, particularly among millennials and I will even say Gen Xers and the next Gen Zers, this tension between how long do we wait, or which is a better approach, or we've been asking for how long. I mean, that's when I came across Judge Motley, I was steeped in kind of Black power, reading literature, the time is now, blah, 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 if you will. And I think there's a space and place for both of those. But what Judge Motley offers and held the space and her whole energy was knowing the impact that she would have even from folks who would never know her name, right? Who would never know that her work, her commitment, even her being aware of her invisibility would have an impact on others becoming visible, right? So even when I came across her in the 70s by way of clerking, the way she walked in a room, it was clear that she knew what representation matters. She was aware of just presence itself, right? And to hold that space, even in the face of your own, if you will, being invisible or erased. Listen, I may not, Natalie, I'm not the first one here at this law school to have first Black woman to be a law professor, but I am the second. And for the last 2 decades, almost 2 decades, have been the only tenured faculty member. That's not an easy space and energy to hold. Like when you are erased or hyper visible, as Dean Nelson, visibly hyper visible, invisibly hyper visible, both of those, right? And so to hold on and stay committed, notwithstanding those things, to see further out, even for us, for benefits you may not even be around to achieve that. Again, formidable woman. So I'll offer that as my thoughts for everything that everyone has said, particularly Dean Nelson offering all the cases that she may not have even known that she would feel the effect of, but she knew that the effect would be there.
And I think to answer Professor Kalami's, my first sort of introduction was in law school. Having, been a first generation college student and a first generation law student, there weren't a lot of examples for me, not just in my own community, but in the wider community of, attorneys of color, but in particular, female attorneys of color who had reached the heights that Judge Motley had reached. And for myself, being at a predominantly white institution and not having that many, I'll call it a critical mass of students of color in my law school, we, grabbed onto anything that we could possibly grab onto to sort of, I like the term that you use, making the invisible visible. Like we wanted to be visible and we wanted to be seen. And a part of that was making sure that we brought forward our heroes and our inspirations and made sure that the larger community knew about them and knew about their accomplishments at the same time that we were educating ourselves, because many of us didn't know. At the same time, we were educating ourselves to educate our peers, because that was important. It was important to be seen. It was important to know that there were individuals that, came before us, and, don't diminish being the second, because sometimes, being the second, there's a long space between the third, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth. So as you're experiencing right now, and even for the first, there could be a long space in between for all of us, for whoever the next person is. And so I think this concept of making yourself visible is very much wrapped up in how much we know about our history and the people that came before us and the paths that they paved for us. And that's knowing about a Black female judge in my 20s is how long it took me to realize that such a thing even existed.
Well, I would say it took me even longer than that. So it really was not until I became a law professor and started teaching my seminar, to be quite honest. And just as I started becoming more knowledgeable myself about, civil rights, and particularly in the education context and the road to Brown, and just reading more about her and her impact and wondering why her name is not at the tip of our tongues like a Thurgood Marshall. And for that matter, also, Charles Hamilton Houston, I had not heard his name, growing up in high school and middle school. I'd heard Thurgood Marshall, Thurgood Marshall, Thurgood Marshall. So again, these unsung, heroes and heroines. And so that was really the first time I really became, to know her. And of course, have tried to, and the students that I'm teaching. And so as they carry that legacy forward, that her contributions are much more well known. And I think going back to what Natalie said in her original remarks, that is our purpose. Our purpose is to have intention while we're in these roles so that we can lay down tracks that hopefully will not be taken up after we're no longer in these roles. And I've heard it, said, in a certain kind of way that we are planting seeds for trees whose shade other people will sit under. And so that's exactly what Judge Motley did. She planted these seeds of desegregation, of racial integration, of civil rights, of equal pay for teachers. Those were also, some of those precursors to Brown and after Brown, and trying to equalize teacher salaries and things like that, and economic mobility and economic justice, housing. She was obviously very impactful in housing discrimination cases as well. And again, she may not have could see the impact that she was going to have for generations and generations and generations, but nonetheless, she persevered and she planted those seeds so that all of us and our children and our children's children can sit under that shade. And it's incumbent upon us to continue to do so in the roles that we have.
And I'll jump in next. I don't remember exactly when I first heard about her, but I think it was probably in college. I was an African and African American studies major. So I think I first heard her name then, but it didn't really sit with me until I was a young attorney. Professor Marilyn Ford, who I believe is probably in the audience today, had a phenomenal seminar at Quinnipiac Law School on her life and legacy at some point when I was an early young attorney. And it was profoundly impactful to hear about her, not just the facts of her being appointed and being a first, but to hear about her as a person, her life, more of the personal side of things as we're discussing today. And I think for young people as well as young adults, most of us heard of her so far when we were adults. It's so powerful to hear of a person who has aspired and accomplished so many great things, just being a person. This is someone who had a family, grew up in the community, who went to a certain high school, learning that the high school she went to was the neighborhood high school that I would have gone to had I not gone to a magnet school. Those are the things that stuck with me and helped for me to connect to her story and to understand that when she says, don't think anything is impossible, right? That's essentially what her quote says, that we can aspire to change those things, regardless of anything that might seem to be in the way today. Profoundly impactful for me. And so that's the short answer. And I certainly relate to this feeling of hyper visibility and invisibility in certain places and spaces. I think a big part of her responsibility, like ours, is knowing that a big part of what we do is just showing up and being at the table and in the room and in these places and spaces where, again, we may be learning more than we're contributing, but we need to be in these places and spaces because we're representing so much more than ourselves.
All right, for me, I have always been into Black history. So research has always been a big part of what I've done on my own. And so I learned about Judge Motley when I was a young child, when I was younger. And, but I went back to her specifically once in May of last year, once I realized I was going to be the chief public defender, because there are so many similarities. She's an advocate. She was in the court. She was defending. That's what I do. I'm a public defender. I've done that my entire career. So our similarities were the things that really brought me back to her specifically.
We've gotten a few questions from the audience, and I think our speakers have done a great job addressing them. I'd like to give our speakers an opportunity to add any last final words tonight before we wrap up. Is there anything anyone would like to add at this point before we start to close the session?
Just want to say thank you for the opportunity. And again, it's wonderful to be amongst these other Black women who are just inspiring and positive in their own rights. And so, but to speak about Judge Motley, it was such an honor because she is a true trailblazer and she's a true advocate. So thank you.
I want to thank as well, just listening in and hearing everyone's comments. Thank you for the invitation, the organizers, and working with me and my schedule, and I'm sure everyone else's schedule. I also just wanted to offer a comment to, I think it was Matt who asked the question, what would Judge Motley say now, right? What should we do? How would she nudge? And in this moment that we find ourselves in the profession and challenges to critical race theory, Black history, all of it, walking around, driving, walking while Black, whatever it is. Or as the dean said, fearless fortitude in the face of foolishness. I feel like I'm gonna quote that several times. But I think what Judge Motley would offer would be this notion of not being reactive, right? It's important to be strategic, to pull back, to retreat, to retrench, to think through what is your next move? Where are you with your own space? And holding space where we are, rather than reacting and burning out, but forming community and building what you think the next move should be and how you can contribute. I think she did that for me in a number of ways by way of nudging. So I offer that as I think she continues to show herself.
And in closing, of course, I also want to just reiterate my thanks to these wonderful panelists and for the CBA and CBF and the family for having this great conversation. But I think one other thing that Akila talked about that it is worth underscoring is the importance of self-care. All of us, particularly for those of us who are in the legal profession, regardless of what profession you're in, the weight of responsibilities, the weight of the world, the weight of our daily lives is heavy. And it's really important that as we are serving others, as we are advocating for others, that as we are championing others, that we also are advocating for ourselves, that we are serving ourselves, that we are being champions for ourselves. Because, I love with Judge Motley and having her family home, here outside of the city, where she could go to retreat and to really just recuperate. And I think that's so important, and to be with our families, to be with our friends, to be with our sisters-in-law, to be with those support systems, I think is incredibly, incredibly important. So I just thought that was worth underscoring. That is also part of her legacy, and that is another example we should be following.
I echo everything that was said and want to thank everyone for the opportunity to speak, but also want to thank my panelists because I've learned a lot more than I knew coming into this, and continue to persevere.
And my final note would just be to echo and thank the Bar Foundation and the Bar Association and everybody who helped to put this on, as well as my fellow panelists. This has been phenomenal. The one final thought that I would just underscore is, she was a proud woman. Her gender factored into, as we touched on earlier, a lot of what she had to deal with, and being in a predominantly, what is still today, a predominantly male profession. I think each of us have interactions very frequently where we walk into a room, and sometimes very often for me, speaking for myself, I'm the only woman in the room or at the table. And having the confidence to know that it doesn't really matter when it comes to the work, right? That you're there because you're supposed to be there, and being able to model that for the men in the room too, to understand and to get comfortable with women being at the table and having something of value to offer, not just in terms of supporting roles, but also in leadership roles. And so I think that is something that I feel she, without having met her, but based on everything that I've heard about her, read about her, and learned about her, that she modeled that very confidently and comfortably, and something that I aspire to do as well.
All right. Anything else before we wrap up? Well, thank you so much again. Thank you everyone who was able to join us tonight for this session. Thank you again to all of our speakers for sharing their knowledge, their expertise, their reflections on Judge Motley. Thank you to the Connecticut Bar Association and the Connecticut Bar Foundation for continuing to support and hold this speaker series. We will have more information coming up about next year's Constance Baker Motley series coming out later this summer. So please stay tuned for that. Please see the chat again for the information about today's event, this session's verification codes, as well as the post-presentation survey. So thank you all so much again, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Have a good night, everyone.